into our next panel, which is going to focus on the regulatory aspects of the COVID vaccine trials. It's hard to imagine really a more critical task for biomedical research than ensuring that these trials are conducted with the highest standards of ethical and regulatory rigor. And the US really is fortunate in having a regulatory authority, the US FDA, that is a highly valued global leader in conducting impeccable reviews of new products, procedures, and vaccines, and that really has been for decades a global gold standard. This panel is going to be co-chaired by Professor Kathy Neuzil, who with Larry Corey is the other co-chair for the HVTN, and who directs the Center for Vaccine Development at our sister Baltimore institution, the University of Maryland. So we're delighted to have her. And Dr. Josh Sharfstein, who is now the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice at the Bloomberg School, and a former FDA official when Margaret Hamburg was FDA Commissioner under the Obama administration. We'll begin with a keynote address from Dr. Peter Marks, who is current director of the FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which has regulatory authority for these vaccines. And he will then be joined for a panel discussion with both the co-chairs and with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, another former FDA commissioner from 2017 to 2019. So we think this is really an extraordinarily important component of the day, and we are really thrilled that Dr. Marks and the other co-chairs and panelists are with us to talk about these critical issues. So Dr. Neuzil and Dr. Sharfstein, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And I think, as you said, this panel follows nicely with the introductions by the previous moderators and speakers. As we've heard, we do face an unprecedented global pandemic, but we also face high levels of mistrust and confusion in the community. And while much of this stems from the characteristics of this pandemic itself, a new virus for which new evidence is emerging rapidly and necessitating constant reappraisals of policy and prevention guidelines, it's certainly compounded by concerns regarding lack of transparency and possible political interference. And while masking and social distancing are clearly effective, we know that complementary, durable solutions are needed. So this really creates a challenge for vaccine developers and regulators, as we want and need a safe and effective vaccine as soon as possible to combat this global health emergency. But we likewise recognize that many of these vaccine platforms are new and that we have relatively short safety follow-up and potentially limited data on certain populations when our pre-stated efficacy endpoints are achieved. I'm going to turn to Josh for the flip side of that paradigm.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. And it's complicating these important scientific challenges is the other part of the challenge, which is confidence. Confidence for clinicians to recommend vaccine to patients, confidence for patients to roll up their sleeves, confidence for people to recruit their neighbors to get them to be vaccinated. One might imagine that in the past or under different circumstances, just the say-so of FDA that a vaccine is safe and effective would be enough to give confidence. But I think we could probably agree that's not the environment we're in today. Confidence comes from trust, from credibility, and from integrity, the topic of today's event. So I'll turn to Dr. Marks, who first, let me say, has such a stellar reputation and is doing an incredibly important job at an incredibly important moment in time. We know that just today, FDA posted specific guidance for when the agency would consider a safe and effective vaccine for emergency use authorization, even as there are stories about whether FDA would release that guidance. And so I'm looking forward to your remarks and hope you're able to comment on what you would say to people who are concerned about FDA's ability to maintain integrity in this process.
So thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I'm really very grateful to be here today and be able to talk to you about this. And you've all gotten to the heart of what this is about, at least for me, and I think for the career staff at FDA who are involved in the evaluation and the approval of vaccines, which is that what we have to do, our process must end up ultimately increasing trust in vaccines, and because without that vaccine confidence, we're not going to get to where we need to. Now, the truth is our regulatory mandate is for quality, safety, and efficacy of vaccines. But all of that's for naught if, just as you said, people don't roll up their sleeve and take those vaccines. Because without getting to the point of having a large fraction of the population vaccinated with a reasonably effective vaccine, we're going to continue to be in places like my basement right now, where we'll be working from home for long periods of time. So we need to get back to normal lives. So what are we doing about that? Well, I think we're trying to make sure that as we consider what we do for a vaccine, that we're very clear about what is happening in terms of an emergency use authorization versus how we would normally approve a vaccine, which is a biologics license application. And I think to get to the heart of what our guidance that was released today says, one of the real key pieces of this, and it was already articulated in guidance that we released on June 30th, 2020, but the heart of this is that the standard for a biologics license application is like the standard for other drugs, which is that we have to have substantial evidence of effectiveness derived from adequate and well-controlled trials in order to approve something. Now, that's different from what was put in place for things like emergency use authorization. For emergency use authorization, the standard deliberately was set lower because of the nature of these chemical, biologic, or radionuclear events where you might not have a chance to make things happen. And so it was, you have to just have may be effective, and the known and potential benefits have to outweigh the known and potential risks. So that's not all that reassuring to many people, perhaps because it doesn't sound like what we do for a biologics license application. And indeed, when we think about what we need for confidence with a vaccine, what we're talking about is that we will need to have something more than just that floor for an emergency use authorization. And what that will be is that we'll need to see data from a large, well-designed phase 3 clinical trial that shows clear and compelling evidence of effectiveness of that vaccine. And that's what's going to get these vaccines over the hump. And you've already heard from Dr. Corey what's being done and to get there. And those are the large trials that will help get us there. Not only are we going to have those data, but we're also going to vet them in a public venue. We're going to take those data. We will look at them after they've been submitted to the agency, make sure that they meet the quality manufacturing standards that we've set, and those are articulated in that guidance, and the safety and efficacy standards. But we'll also take them to a public advisory committee meeting that will be broadcast widely, and people will be able to watch it. Hopefully, if it's picked up, we will certainly have opportunities for people to watch via web, as well as make the feed available. So we want that to be a public enough process that people can see that there are independent experts that are part of the advisory committee meeting can discuss that. They can discuss the pros and cons of where we stand. And at the end of the day, if that advisory committee recommends that we authorize something, we'll then take that back and decide what to do. Obviously, there is a balance here because I've talked about effectiveness, but there is this question of safety. And I can't deny that we will have a narrower amount of safety data than we would for a usual approval. There's no way around that. But what we do have now that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago is these large claims-based databases and claims-based databases that are linked to the electronic medical record. So we can put together a combination of active surveillance in addition to the passive vaccine surveillance reporting that we'll have as well, and hopefully make up for some of that by watching very closely for safety events. After all, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and there does have to be a little bit of balancing here. I mean, ideally, you'd like to have longer term safety follow-up. But on the other hand, with close to 1,000 people or more dying a day, we have to balance this out. And obviously, we're not going to allow anything to proceed that we have any significant concerns for safety on. But this is what has to be done here in this setting. And so all of that we've articulated in the guidance. We'll continue to articulate that. We'll continue to try to be as transparent as we can about what we do, because ultimately we do need to make sure that regardless of where someone comes on the spectrum of their beliefs, that they can at least trust in this and feel confident that what comes through our process is something, because we at FDA are comfortable giving that vaccine to our families, they will feel comfortable giving it to their families. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Marks. One very quick follow-up, and I appreciate you're talking about both efficacy and safety. The guidance talks about 2 months of median follow-up time for safety. Maybe in your own words, why 2 months? Why is that a good amount? How did you strike that balance, sort of getting to the transparency and how this comes? Because you're vulnerable for people saying that's waiting too long, and some people saying that's not enough time. And how would you kind of explain that decision?
So that's a really great question. And actually, there's something that's really amazing that you can actually use sometimes, and that is you can sometimes actually use data. And if you look at when most adverse events, the majority of them have occurred by, and the kind of a median time, it's somewhere around 2 to 3 months. One could say it's a little shorter for certain events. For instance, a Guillain-Barré, perhaps it's 6 weeks. But for transverse myelitis, it's more like 3 months. And so we picked 2 months as something that was reasonably aggressive, yet also somewhat, it's kind of in the middle, not too aggressive, not too conservative, in the middle. It's possible that other regulatory authorities, and you may see this with WHO, they may choose that they'd like somewhat longer follow-up. But we feel that with the safety surveillance we have in place, that about 2 months is a reasonable amount of follow-up as a median. Because with these very large trials, it means we will have a reasonable cohort, hopefully, of people that will be more than 2 months. And obviously, it'll depend on exactly the time of the EUA submission.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Marks, and we will get back to you with some specific questions. But first, I'd like to turn to Dr. Gottlieb. And Scott, 2 things really. I'd like to give you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks, and then I'd ask if you could very specifically comment on the role of transparency, including a public advisory committee in demonstrating that the process has integrity.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity today. I'll just say with respect to the guidance, because it bears on the discussion around transparency that was included in the AdCom document, saying I'm reading on Twitter was put out today, but I'm not sure if that's correct. So with respect to that guidance, there are a few moments that I could think of where so much political dust was created by political officials for so little actual practical effect. I mean, perhaps negative effect towards whatever purpose was prescribed here. I think the bottom line is that FDA is going to stick to the objective criteria that they outlined in that guidance. The AdCom is going to support those principles, and the sponsors are going to adhere to them. Because the most important thing here for the from the drug maker's perspective, and I think for the public health purpose, is public affirmation of the FDA role in this process. I can't imagine a circumstance where a sponsor should or would challenge or seek to undermine the FDA's role here. We create objective processes in this country. We seek to create neutral regulators for a reason. We want certain decisions to be divorced from commercial or political considerations. In this case, we want the decision around the market entry of a vaccine for COVID to be guided purely by public health considerations. So this is precisely the moment that we need an objective, neutral arbiter, and we need to do everything we can, all of us, I think, participating in this enterprise, to affirm the institution and the process. I think the transparency is exceedingly important because it affirms that. It basically affirms the neutrality of the agency, the rigor of the process. I think understanding that these decisions are being looked in on by people who are expert in these fields, both inside the FDA as well as among its advisory committee members, is extremely important. And I think people, the general public, understanding that there's a neutral arbiter here, not a political actor making considerations, not a commercial actor making considerations, but a neutral arbiter that we've invested in over many decades and imbued with expertise and authority making these decisions, is going to be extremely important, ultimately getting to Peter's point, to building public trust so that we see a high rate of utilization of a safe and effective vaccine, assuming we have one, and we still have a ways to go. Clinical trials have not read out yet. So you don't know until you know whether these vaccines are going to work.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And Peter, I promised you a more specific question, and here it is. So there have been lots of questions and lots of media attention about the clinical hold on the AstraZeneca study. We know this could adversely affect the trials, and it could adversely affect the uptake from vaccines. Unfortunately, information has leaked through investor calls. And so understanding it's inappropriate to share private medical information and to adjudicate specific medical diagnoses in a public forum, what is the right level of transparency for credibility about clinical holds?
So thanks for that question. I can't speak to any manufacturer's application that's on file when it has to do with the investigation of drug applications, but I can speak to all of them in general. And that is, I think we really trust that the sponsors of these trials will be as transparent as they can as part of the compact that we've entered into for society right now. We are working together with the sponsors of these trials. I mean, obviously there is obviously some degree of an adversarial relationship here. I mean, or a push-pull, because we are regulators, okay? On the other hand, we are there to also be their partners to move these things along. And I think from my perspective, we would encourage any manufacturer of a vaccine, any sponsor of a vaccine, to be as transparent as possible about what is going on here within the realm of keeping the privacy of those enrolled in the trial. We very rarely, when we are very concerned about a sponsor not being adequately transparent, can have things like a commissioner's finding where we can make known safety information that would normally be kept secret under an investigation of drug application. But I would really hope we don't have to get to those kind of places here, because I think the real important thing here is all of us need to understand that unless we work together, industry, with government, with academia, we all have to come together to bring everyone back to understanding how incredible vaccines are. I mean, I'm going to have to say this. Just think about what vaccines have done for us. The problem is we're spoiled, right? Nobody here knows what, I don't know if anyone here could diagnose a case of smallpox if they saw it outside of a textbook. I mean, We are so spoiled about this. We don't understand. Most of us who haven't worked in low and middle income countries don't know what a case of polio looks like. We don't understand what measles encephalitis looks like. And that's because of vaccines. And so we have to be there to make sure that we develop that trust once again and work together. So it's not just FDA, it's the whole ecosystem working together to help people trust what we do.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I think I definitely want to pause for a second and explore a little bit on the integrity in the system and how it relates to the agency versus manufacturers, because I certainly have taken the position in the past that the agency should be doing more of the communicating, not necessarily relying on the companies, because people will trust you, Dr. Marks, and perhaps more than they will a company. And if what we're talking about is trust, really understanding what you're thinking in a way may be able to give that trust. And so my question is for Dr. Gottlieb. Where do you think industry is right now in their concern over the integrity of the process? And do you think that some of these companies might be willing to let FDA, without doing a whole lot of rulemaking, be a little bit more forthcoming about some of these issues like the clinical hold in order to inspire more confidence in the process?
Well, look, you've seen some unusual transparency that's not typical in terms of the companies releasing the protocols. And so I think that everyone's trying to lean forward here.
And I saw one of the companies is even promising to release the data.
I think you're going to see companies try to be very transparent around how the data gets put out. You saw the bottom line data from the phase 1, phase 2 studies put on preprint servers because you wanted to get it out quickly, but it wasn't just put in press release. There was more granularity provided. I think you're going to see efforts made across the board. I talked to a lot of sponsors, as you know, Josh. I think you're going to see efforts across the board to try to lean forward here and provide more transparency. I think everyone recognizes these are unusual circumstances and there's an unusual public health imperative. But, you know, as I said at the outset, I think the bottom line is that the more that we can imbue the regulatory process with integrity and recognize the regulator here as an authority, I think that's going to be really pivotal to getting public trust around these vaccines. And so I'd be very skeptical that anyone would question, sort of the regulator in this context or the regulatory standards that are being put forward, and nobody should. I think that this is one of those moments where we have to really support the principles that are being put forward by FDA. And that's what I think you're going to continue to see, along with, to your point, I think a lot of transparency around the public release of information, data, protocols.
Do you think that'll extend to issues like clinical holds?
Well, there's only one. I gather there's only one sponsor right now that you're referring to. I mean, look, I think that we should be very transparent around what we know around safety questions to the extent it's possible, because there's going to be some common questions across these vaccines, and if you have any safety issues, the immediate question is going to be: is the safety issue related to the platform that's being used, or is it related to the epitope? And if it's related to the epitope, then it becomes a common issue across all the vaccines. If it's related to the platform, then it's particular to certain classes of vaccines. Understanding questions like that is going to be very important. And it's going to be important also for helping guide clinicians in what to look for in the accruing clinical trials. I mean, FDA can look, and FDA will look across all the clinical trial data, but to the extent that these things are disclosed publicly, I think that makes clinicians in the trials more alert. And so if you think that the epitope or a certain platform might be leading to certain neurological side effects, you might look more closely at some neurological side effects that typically might be not overlooked, but classified quickly. Things that are subtle side effects could be looked at more closely if there was sort of shared learnings across these trials about what we should be looking for. So I think it's important. I think it's going to get to to the extent that we're all trying to work on getting to a quick answer here, given the public health urgency, the transparency is going to yield that.
Great, thank you.
So perhaps one final question, and maybe you can both comment quickly. We only have a few minutes left. This is truly a a global effort, and many of these constructs are being tested elsewhere in the world. How do you work with other regulators in other parts of the world to make sure that you have full access to safety data and that if signals emerge, you could detect them as early as possible?
So I would say that this, one of the things that really has been unprecedented in the COVID-19 outbreak has been the coming together of global regulators in sharing information, both in terms of our bilateral and multilateral agreements that we have, as well as in larger groups of regulators that come together, and even the largest group, which is the WHO. But this sharing has been really remarkable, whereby, without getting specific, one regulator, if they see something that doesn't look right, will ask another regulator, and they'll make us aware of it. And we've shared information like this, and that has actually really helped us. So we are very grateful to our global regulatory colleagues. I think we will continue this information sharing. Obviously, just to reassure everyone, at the end of the day, we're not going to be relying on somebody else. We're going to be making the decision based on FDA's gold standard, essentially, or our work on looking at this. And we're not going to be relying on somebody else telling us that they thought that something was okay to approve or anything like this, because we are the regulator that actually does look at the data, and we pride ourselves on that. That being said, this exchange of information on adverse events, on clinical trials, is tremendously helpful. And I hope this actually is something that goes on past this COVID time. This could be very helpful into the future.
Thank you. Scott, any final comments?
No, I just wish my colleagues at FDA the best through what are difficult circumstances. So it's good being with you, Peter, and good seeing you again.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Great.
I really appreciate it. We appreciate Dr. Gottlieb has been very supportive through this period and various venues like this one, and we're very grateful for that.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much to both of you for coming.
Well, thanks so much for an extraordinary panel. And I think it's fair to say, that we've given frontline healthcare workers and providers, nurses, physicians, a lot of kudos for their heroic efforts. Well, there's heroism in regulatory integrity too. And we all really appreciate the extraordinary efforts of the scientific professionals at the FDA.